那我们还是会感到疑惑，说是不是所有的犹太人都住在以色列呢？让我们来问一问可汗教授这个问题吧。可汗教授，您是犹太人，但是您住在美国，那我们很好奇，是不是所有的犹太人都住在以色列呢？
So there are about 7 million Jews living in Israel, and approximately that number in the United States, out of an entire Jewish population worldwide of approximately 20 million. So not all Jews live in Israel, but most Jews have an emotional connection to the state of Israel. Now, in the year 70 CE, the temple was destroyed, and the Jews were exiled from Israel, and the state at that time ceased to exist until the state of Israel was reestablished in 1948. During that long period of almost 2,000 years, the Jews always had in their mind to return to Jerusalem, to return to Israel. And we spoke last time about Jews investing for the long term. This is a perfect example of that, because throughout their dispersion, throughout the various countries, they kept in their heart that desire to return. Now, there's one day on the Jewish calendar, we call it Tish'a B'Av, the 9th day of the 5th lunar month, which falls out approximately in July or August most years. And so Jewish people on that day sit on the ground and they mourn and they cry for the temple that was destroyed. And actually nowadays you can go back to where the temple used to stand. There's one small section of an outside wall. It's called the Western Wall, and it used to be called the Wailing Wall, where Jews used to go and cry. But we always cried one day a year to remember that temple. And Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the famous French general and emperor who conquered most of Europe at the beginning of the 19th century, he once entered a synagogue on Tish'a B'Av, on that day, and he saw Jews crying. And he said, why are they crying? Why are they sitting in the dark with candles and crying? And someone explained to him that it's because they remember their ancient temple that was destroyed and their ancient state that was destroyed. And he remarked, if they keep that hope alive for so long, by then it was over 1,700 years, they will definitely go back to their state. They will be able to reestablish their state. And the national anthem of the state of Israel is Hatikvah. It means the hope, the desire to return to Israel. And that is the Jewish hope to come back to Israel. And that's implanted within every one of us. So not all Jews live in Israel, but we all have a connection to Israel. And many Jews seek to visit Israel as tourists, and some of us study in Israel as well, and I did so myself in the 1980s.
您知道以色列最让我感到敬佩的地方是它的高科技发展，还有农业发展。以色列的创业科技公司数量之多，可以被称为第二硅谷。同时呢，在沙漠地带开辟绿洲，这真的是一片流着奶和蜜的土地呢。
Yes, that's a fascinating aspect of the modern state of Israel. And in order to understand it, we have to go back to the beginnings of the state. And even before that, for the hundreds of years when the Jews were stateless, they dreamed of returning to Israel. But it was just theoretical. When they came to Israel, they had to deal with modern challenges of establishing a state. And so, for example, Israel was swampland. They had to drain the swamps. It was desert. They had to learn how to irrigate in the desert. Now, over the hundreds of years when the Jews were in Europe and in the Muslim lands, they were defenseless because they didn't have a military, they didn't have political autonomy. And so during the Holocaust of World War II, 6 million Jews were murdered and could not defend themselves. In the modern state of Israel, when the Arab armies attacked the Jewish state at superior odds, the Jewish state, the Jewish people had a way to defend themselves. And the Israeli army has excelled in many ways. And that's part of this startup nation. And I could talk about that for a long time, but let me just talk about two particular examples. One example is the Israeli Air Force. The Israeli Air Force started, my father showed me photos of the old airplanes from the First World War that were tiny airplanes that they used in the War of Independence. But as the years went on, Israel developed new technologies, and they even created their own fighter jet. The most famous of them is the Kafir fighter jet, and Israeli pilots are also well known for their capabilities. I'd also like to mention a second example, which is particularly dramatic. In 1976, an Air France airline flight was hijacked, and it was brought to Uganda. And there were many Jewish passengers on board, and they were being held hostage in Entebbe. And it looked like another massacre of Jews was going to occur. And what the Israeli High Command did is they planned a commando raid. This was in 1976. I remember it. I was 12 years old. I was in summer camp. It was probably in July. And we were all very worried. And all of a sudden, we heard that there was a commando raid, and they saved all of the passengers, and with only one Israeli casualty, and that was Jonathan Netanyahu, whose younger brother is now the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. How were the Israelis able to do it? Because they had the technology, and they actually knew the compound where the Jewish people were being held because they had built it. Because in the 1960s and early 70s, the Jewish state assisted many African countries to build up their infrastructure. So they had the knowledge of that compound, and they were able to execute that dramatic rescue. So there's actually a film about this daring rescue. It's called 7 Days in Entebbe. Rucha Yong Zhongwen Shua.
在恩德培的7天。
Yes, so that's the film, and people who have seen it in China have told me that it's very exciting. But as important as the military advances may be, the peaceful technological advances are even more important. And in fact, the state of Israel shares much of this technology with its Arab neighbors with whom they've made peace over the last decades. And let me give two examples. Number one, I mentioned Israel is mostly desert, and the whole region of the Middle East is mostly arid land. And so Israel has developed technologies of hothouses and irrigation to plant crops and vegetables in the sand and use minimal water, and they produce wonderful vegetables and wonderful produce that is really used to export throughout the world. The other fascinating dimension of this startup nation of coming up with new solutions to problems is the procedure of desalinization of seawater. Because Israel lacks rainwater and lacks river water, but there's plenty of seawater, but it's salty. So what Israel has done is created factories that takes the salt out of the water and puts in minerals into the water so that it can be used for irrigation in abundance. And this is shared not only by Israel, but also by its Arab neighbors as well. So probably the most important export of Israel is high tech, whether it's computer science, whether it's robotics, whether it's medicine. And Israel, as we know during the coronavirus pandemic, was the country that really was the quickest to vaccinate its population, and also was tracking the progress and the benefits of the vaccine. So Israel, as a Jewish state, focuses on education and looks for the long term.
明白了，没了奶和蜜的以色列，还有创新和教育，真的希望以后有机会能去这片土地看看呢。
真棒，以色列欢迎你。
谢谢。